With Miranda Kahn, J.D. Hayworth as America's Forum continues, and we continue to discuss a story we talked about a little bit yesterday. The House of Commons in the United Kingdom voted to allow the world's first three-person IVF baby.
Yeah, the story is starting to create a lot of buzz. Doctors who support the measure say it will prevent babies from inheriting incurable diseases.
And you see the story on Newsmax World at Newsmax.com, but critics say it's akin to cloning and one step closer to creating designer babies. Our good friend Ford O'Connell, the Republican strategist, remains with us from Newsmax Washington. Also joining us for the discussion via telephone, Dr. Vliet. She phones in from Tucson, the preventive medicine physician and the former director of the American Association of American Physicians and Surgeons. We also have our good friend Dr. Sanjay Jain, the author of the book Optimal Living 360. He joins us via Skype from Washington. Let's get into this discussion as we cite the paper The Telegraph, quoting fertility expert Professor Robert Winston. He backs this vote in the House of Commons, saying the three-person technique is no more sinister than a blood transfusion. Dr. Vliet, to you first. Do you have some concerns about this?
I do, J.D. Thank you for having me on. I really feel that we're getting into uncharted waters and significant ethical concerns when we are getting away from the standard medical concept of a fertilized egg is the product of an egg and a sperm rather than three people. And it also raises a lot of potential legal issues down the road. I really think we're starting to play with fire on this.
Dr. Sanjay Jain, your thoughts?
You know, it's very fascinating to hear about the technology, but I agree, there is some concern. We hear about the successes, but what's happened to the complications? Can these babies that are being created, can there be birth defects beyond the mitochondrial benefits that they're claiming? So I wonder, when they research this, have there been any complications?
Well, we know there can always be complicating factors in that ultimate oxymoron, political science. Ford O'Connell, you're there in Washington on the Hill. The House of Commons went for this. I can't envision the Congress in its current makeup here in the United States voting to authorize the same kind of thing.
No, a lot of folks, particularly on the Republican side, think that you're playing God. And not only that, there are some complications that could come out of this. My question for the doctors is, really 1 in 6,500 children suffer this mitochondrial disease. Is there another way to mitigate this from coming about other than just this three DNA procedure?
What about that, Dr. Vliet? Are you familiar?
Well, I don't have a lot of information on that, so I'd prefer to see what the other person has to say.
Well, let's defer to Dr. Sanjay Jain. Dr. Jain, your response to what Ford brought up.
Well, there are other alternatives. First of all, you can do a lot of genetic screening. So if there is a potential for a risk with some of these DNAs or people who have this mitochondrial defect, then you can screen that out and kind of prevent those measures in terms of procreation and getting involved. So there's some genetic screening you can do. I'm sure there's other ways to mitigate this, but that's one area I would suggest.
Final note comes from Lord Winston, the professor of science and society at Imperial College London and an IVF pioneer. He says, quote, "As an Orthodox Jew, my religious tradition sees no objection to using science in this way. This is to be celebrated as we are using the God-given intelligence afforded us." With a half minute remaining, I would imagine, Dr. Vliet, you will see objections in the religious community in the United States to this proposal.
Well, I would expect so, J.D., and in fact, I also object. I think we are playing God. I agree with the previous statements on that point, and I think we are opening up a Pandora's box of medical, legal, ethical, and moral issues. I don't agree with this approach.
And we will be back to continue the discussion on another medical topic right after this.
The reason is that we can take away funding for that program because of the Affordable Care Act. The Affordable Care Act actually guarantees that every citizen in this country has access to free preventative care, including the measles vaccine. So we no longer need to provide additional government funding to ensure that those vaccines can be administered.
Okay, so Obamacare is going to take care of it. Presidential Press Secretary Josh Earnest defending the administration's budget, specifically the proposal to cut $50 million from the national vaccine program, despite the measles outbreak that is sweeping the country. Let's continue our discussion. Staying with us from Newsmax Washington, Republican strategist Ford O'Connell. On telephone from Tucson, Arizona, Dr. Lee Vliet, the preventive medicine physician whose website is herplace.com. And likewise, Skyping in from Washington, D.C., Dr. Sanjay Jain, board-certified physician and the author of the book Optimal Living 360. Ford, first, a political diagnosis. Why would the president, who loves to spend money, cut $50 million from the vaccine program?
I have no idea, particularly given what's going on in the news media. I don't know how we went from 102 cases of measles in 14 states to whether or not the GOP is the party of science when it comes to this issue. This is one of these things where basically President Obama wants to take a feel-good moment, play on emotion, and boost spending in his new federal budget. So we're going to see how this plays out, but he's obviously playing both sides of this fence.
Dr. Vliet, I want to get your opinion. Some are saying that states should have different rules on vaccinations, but having said that, this was Disneyland where supposedly the measles spread began in California, and supposedly parents are allowed to opt out of getting these vaccines within that state. Is that dangerous territory if states are allowed to decide whether or not which vaccines certain kids should have and which ones they shouldn't?
Well, there are two issues. Number one, vaccines, like all medical issues, really have risk-benefit ratios and need to be a medical decision, not a political one. But this is begging the point. The problem was created by the federal government not following its immigration laws to screen immigrants that were coming across the border as illegal border crossers. I warned about this measles outbreak a year ago when we were seeing the flood of illegals at the southern borders in California, where the outbreak began, and in Arizona, Texas, and New Mexico, with thousands, hundreds of thousands of people coming across the border, not following the U.S. policies for screening of medical diseases. So the invisible travelers with all these illegal border crossers has created a huge problem. The enterovirus D68, the measles outbreak, tuberculosis, there are a whole host of them. And for the government now to blame parents as the culprit because they don't vaccinate their children when they have legitimate concerns that are medical ones they need to discuss with their physician, for the government to blame the parents is really ludicrous, given the fact that the failure to follow our immigration laws is the start of the problem in the first place.
Well, I understand the situation with the immigration. I agree with you. But in California, we've seen kindergartners since 2000. They've quadrupled on opting out of these vaccinations. What is giving rise to this anti-vaccination movement, particularly among what most people would say are liberals versus Republicans, folks who are basically Prius driving folks who go to Whole Foods? So I'm trying to figure out here the political angle, not just right and left, but why in California in particular are we seeing a rise to this opt-out of vaccinations?
Well, let's go to Sanjay Jain, and we've got about 40 seconds left, Doc.
You know, it's interesting you mentioned California because there's 1,500 daycare centers in which there's 92% of people who are not vaccinated. So that's an incredible number of children who are not vaccinated in several places in California. So you bring a great point. So not only is it an immigration issue, but also a domestic issue. We have to address both those fronts.
And it is something we will have to keep our eye on. Dr. Vliet, to you on the telephone from Tucson, we thank you for your perception and your perspective on this. Dr. Sanjay Jain via Skype from Washington, D.C. Seems like only the other day he was here with us on the anchor desk. And Ford O'Connell, thanks for hoisting up some co-hosting duties from Newsmax Washington. Thanks to all of you, and America's Forum continues right after this, so stay with us.